first and foremost. Okay, it's recording, so we will have this available on YouTube later as well. And then I'll start admitting everyone. It's going to take a little bit.
No problem.
Okay, admit all, and then it's a bit of a process. Okay, so especially while people wait to connect their audio. All, so everyone is muted, and I think everyone is, some have videos. So, stop video. Okay. Perfect. I think we're slowly filling up. And I think I can just start by welcoming everyone as the room is filling with our guests. We had a record number of registrants for our fourth masterclass, this time on Syrah, and with, I think, the most glamorous couple in wine, Chris and Andrea Mullineux, joining us today. If I sound distracted, it's because I'm also managing guests entering and muting and unmuting and removing the videos. So we had, yes, over 80 registrants, which has been absolutely overwhelming. And I am personally extremely excited, not to have you guys first and foremost here joining me, but also to chat about Syrah and go through this journey of Syrah and journey of your journey with Syrah through the various regions in the world. So the way it works, just a few of house rules. Basically, I will screen this presentation. Every one of you should see this presentation, which we have prepared, and we will also be able to share later on with you on a link. This talk is also recorded and will be available on YouTube. And I am moderating the live chat, which basically serves two ways. So on one side, you can just write your questions as we talk along, and as Chris and Andrea go through the various subjects. I will then read them out whenever there is a gap and there's a possibility. And then the other thing is, obviously, during the talk, we will also present some wines. We will focus obviously on Mullineux wines, but we will also have some examples of wines from all over the world, and those are Chris and Andrea's favorite wines from those regions. So those wines are available for order, and I will take the orders in a private chat. You can just write them to me. They're all in very limited quantities, including the Mullineux wines, and so it's we will try and make everyone happy, but it is very much a first come, first serve basis. Apart from that, please just keep your video turned off and mute yourself, feel free to ask any question at any stage, and thank you very much for joining us, first of all. And so welcome, Chris and Andrea. Thank you so much for your time and for joining me on Zoom. How are you doing?
Yeah, we're good, and you, Nick? Thanks for having us and inviting us. We're super happy to be here with you, and yeah, I think we're in the middle of autumn here in Scotland, but it's a pretty warm day here. It's about maybe 30 degrees today, so it feels a little bit unnormal. But sorry, Andrea's just hidden you. I'm pulling you back up. But no, we're very good, thanks, and it's good to be here.
Wonderful. And I mean, obviously, lockdown on a farm is a very different life than lockdown in a city. So I suppose you can focus on the vineyard work and enjoy the outdoors probably more than anyone else. But still, we're all hopeful for some some freedom again fairly soon. So I think if you agree with me, we can just start as I unmute yet another one. Okay, mute. Sorry, apologize for that. And basically explain a little bit what the process was, the thinking behind it. So the thinking was that the Swartland and your South African brand and what you have built is obviously the product and the result of years of experience and of a personal journey. And I think and Syrah, as much as Shannon, but today we focus on Syrah, is obviously at the center of this life of yours in wine. And so what I suggested, and when we chatted, we wanted to go through basically which were the places that were the most significant for you, and which are the wines that have inspired you, and go through those steps. So, and ultimately we end obviously in the Swartland. We end on your farm, Roundstone, which is the apex of your career. But I thought it would be nice to talk about this wonderful grape, this very noble grape, which is Syrah, and talk about its origins, it's a bit of history, and then obviously about the places that have shaped it and then have made it so famous. If you agree. So obviously, I mean, you guys don't need any sort of introduction. I mean, I think everyone that's joining us today has very much an idea about what you do and your brand and how incredibly successful you have been in South Africa. But perhaps you can give me a little bit of an idea just when your journey in wine started, when you guys met, and when this brand started. Just a little bit of an overview, if you don't mind, just so that we can kickstart.
You want to do the intro?
Sure. So, I mean, Chris and I are both first-generation winemakers. We didn't come from winemaking families, and our journey into wine started in a slightly different, from a different angle, but obviously took us to the same place. So I grew up in California, and my grandparents were Italian immigrants. So there was always this sort of wine and food culture, but I was a huge science nerd growing up. I loved all angles of science, from biology to physics, biochemistry. And so when it came time to deciding what to study in university, because in America, we're pretty free on, if you qualify, you can study what you want to. Wine just ticked all those boxes of, you know, art, food, science, culture, travel. So that's really, it was the concept, the sort of romance around and wine and the science backgrounds that really took me to it. So I did study in university, worked in the Napa Valley for a few years, but was drawn to South Africa from my very first day in university when another student that was there with me that happened to be from South Africa showed a copy of Wine Spectator for that month, and wasn't on the cover, but a few pages in, there was a picture of, I don't even know which estate it was, but it was the background mountains and that coral fluorescent color they turn at sunset that made me think, okay, when I start traveling and studying wine abroad, I'm going there. So that's what took me to South Africa. And then... Yeah,
then she met me actually a few weeks later, very kind of fortuitously. I'm obviously from South Africa, born and bred here, and studied, I actually came to Stellenbosch first to study accounting. But I always tell people when I think the first day I was in Stellenbosch, I realized it wasn't what I wanted to spend my life doing, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do yet. But it was just fortunate that I was studying in Stellenbosch, and I absolutely fell in love with wine. Just visiting wineries and wine farms, and just really got the bug. And so while I was having this midlife crisis at 19, 20 years old, I was discovering my true passion. And it was, one day I just met someone who was studying winemaking and found out it was possible to study. And my first internship was actually at the Trafford Winery. So I remember going up there one day as a student. I'd heard about the wines and tasted one, I think it was his Merlot, like the 98 Merlot, which was absolutely beautiful and so different to anything. So I went and met David and got an internship there. But the wine that really struck me, that vintage, my favorite wine to work with, whether it was, harvesting the fruit or punch downs or just smelling the fermentation, was his Syrah. It was really, I think that vintage in 2001, working in the Trafford with his Syrah was the thing that kind of got me addicted to Syrah.
Was that already the 393 Syrah that made him so famous as well in America?
No, I think at that time it was just the Trafford Syrah, or Shiraz. He had just one. And it just had this incredible aroma and intensity to it, and it was just so beautiful, yeah. So I kind of got hooked on Syrah then, and that led me to being interested in the Swartland. I met Eben as a student and did some practicals with him in the vineyards. And then I got a job out of university working in Tulbach. It's now called Fable. So I kind of started that up. It was called Tulbach Mountain Vineyards then. And we obviously planted a lot of Syrah there. But we also started another label, buying grapes in, a kind of a negociant label where we worked with Syrah from the Swartland. And we didn't want to use any new oak in the wine. So I ended up buying sort of used barrels from wineries, mostly from Stellenbosch. And Andrea was working at Waterford in 2004. And I popped into Waterford to go and pick up some barrels and met Andrea there. So that's where our journey together started, yeah.
But that was like a super quick, like I didn't know his name. It was just kind of like our eyes met over some barrels. And we were actually both working in the south of France when we got to actually know each other.
Like 6 months later.
We happened to be on the same train to Champagne, which I always say sounds like a euphemism, but you can,
could
can really just hop on a train to Champagne.
I'm going to take you with me, sorry, because my wife forgot her house keys. So you see, this is the wonderful thing about the live streaming. And then I open the door and then I go back to my desk. Apologies, but I need to.
So yeah, Chris and I spent a week together in Champagne before going back to the south of France. And so we had a nice time over, lots of bubbly, getting to know each other. And when we got back to the south of France, I was working in Châteauneuf-du-Pape and Chris was working in Bandol. And we really bonded over, talking about wine and drinking wine. And obviously we were in relatively the same part of the world. So we were both drawn towards a similar style of wine. We're able to share our experiences and our stories of working in France at different wineries, and realize that, our passion overlapped a lot for each other, but for what was in the glass as well. And so when we came back to South Africa together, our journey had already started towards what we wanted to do.
Yeah. Amazing. So
and then having worked in Tulbach, buying grapes from the Swartland, we knew where the interesting vineyards were. We knew where the interesting sites were, the good farmers were. So when the time came for us to start our project in 2007, we'd already kind of worked out where the best sites were and which vineyards we wanted to work with. So, and that was with a huge focus on Syrah.
Fantastic. And we'll pick up that a little bit later. So in the meantime, actually, what are you drinking? Because I'm drinking a magnificent 15 Syrah.
I like the fact that you got a big bottle there. You're planning to have a nice long.
It's a long talk. I learned from last time.
So we've got a couple of bottles here. The first we've opened is our 2014 Syrah, which you guys did an offer on. So this is out of our library. So every vintage we hold a few hundred bottles back, and this is out of there.
Amazing. Okay, so you mentioned southern France and you mentioned Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and I think we'll get there just now. But perhaps the real star today is Syrah, the grape, Syrah and Shiraz, and perhaps I think it's obviously a very common question. And Andrea, being the scientist in the family, I'm going to ask you a question that you've probably been asked 1,000 times. What is the difference between Syrah and Shiraz? And perhaps you can explain that very quickly.
Sure, I'll take like one step back first. I think one of the common misperceptions about Syrah or Shiraz specifically is that it originates from the town of Shiraz in Persia, which was proven incorrect. It was just sort of lore for probably a few hundred years. But I was actually working in the genetics lab at UC Davis when they actually discovered that it actually has Southern French origins. So, that was with Carol Meredith, and she actually discovered a few other awesome things while I was working for her. So I feel like I have this tiny little part of history, but I was very much in the background. I was 18 at the time. It was the only job in the wine industry I could get. But anyway, so Syrah and Shiraz, same grape. The idea typically is the stylistic. So In France, it's referred to as Syrah. In Australia, it's typically referred to as Shiraz. In South Africa, we're allowed to call it either. And so people who tend to make it with a slightly softer touch, I would say, concentrating more on minerality, more on spice, being more inspired by old world ways of making Syrah, tend to call it Syrah. And people who are maybe making a bolder style, slightly riper, sometimes more wood, but definitely more rounded and more punchy, tend to call it Shiraz.
It feels like it's like belonging to a party. It's like a Republican Democrat thing. Yeah, it's different, nearly different religions. And we are on the Syrah side today. And our journey does start where you mentioned it comes from. And we start in the Rhône Valley. So you mentioned Châteauneuf-du-Pape. Obviously, the Rhône starts far up by Lyon and goes down up to the Mediterranean. And I suppose the actual region is far stretched, and the big part of the production is in the southern part of the Rhône region. But I assume, I think I'm correct in saying that the more exclusive, the smaller production, and most of the more prestigious brands are located in the northern part, and that is where Syrah perhaps has its single varietal expression, and it's most sought after. So what we're going to do here, and I know, Chris, you've worked there as well, so perhaps we can navigate down the Rhône Valley, starting from the Appalachians far up in the north. But perhaps a little bit, I don't know how much you guys have looked into, obviously, how the actual valley has been formed. I found it extremely, extremely interesting. You want to mention something about it?
Yeah, well, maybe just to, again, take a step back. I think, after my time working graduating from university and working in Tulbach, I wanted to go and get international experience, and was obviously had fallen in love with Syrah. So the home of Syrah, being the Northern Rhône, was the obvious place to go. And I kind of started at the north. So my very first vintage, which was in 03, which was kind of a super hot vintage, but I started working in Côte d'Orty. Over the years, I spent a lot of time there, but all the way down south through to Crozes-Hermitage. So we've spent a lot of time there. We built some good friendships up there. Really excited to taste the wines and talk about the wines today, because we actually sell a little bit of wine in France, and our distributor there is Alain Graillot's family. So we do spend quite a bit of time with them, and it's an honor for us to have them as our distributor now. And I think you touched on something really important. Obviously, the geology, which we'll chat about, is really interesting. But the fact that in the Northern Rhône, it tends to be single varieties, and in the Southern Rhône, it tends to be more blends. And I think that's quite an interesting and important thing to look at and maybe just chat briefly about. And it kind of follows most regions around the world. If you're in a slightly more continental climate, so more inland in Europe, it tends to be cooler there. They have a slightly longer growing season, and because of that, the grapes have a longer time on the vine, and it becomes easier and more interesting with single varieties and single vineyards. So if you think of Burgundy, of Alsace, of Germany, and of the Northern Rhône, Beaujolais, it tends to be single varieties and single sites. Whereas closer to the ocean, the more Mediterranean climates, warmer climates, the season tends to be a little bit shorter, and what then becomes interesting for making really special wines is to blend. So either blending varieties like they do in Châteauneuf or in Bordeaux, or using the same variety but blending many vineyards together. So I think that's one of the things that makes the Northern Rhône special. Is it's definitely it is a warmer place, but it's just on the cusp where you're starting to get to a continental climate, and single varieties and single vineyards become really interesting.
Yes, you touched on climate. So I think a few interesting aspects about it. So continental, for sure, so mild winters and hot summers and regular rainfall. I think one of the issues is that rainfall does happen during harvest. I think is one of the threads. Hail is definitely an issue, rot as well. But I think the single most powerful factor is this wind, which is insane wind, which is the Mistral, which is this cold wind that comes down from the north, and the actual Rhône Valley is like a wind tunnel in a way, and I assume. And so this thing blows down quite intensively. And one thing I noticed is that if it blows very strongly during flowering, without getting too technical, obviously, it has a huge effect on the vintage, and that is one of the reasons why vintage variation is so huge in the Northern Rhône.
Yeah, I think Andrea, working in Châteauneuf, she has some good stories about the Mistral. Maybe if you want to tell about your bicycle experience.
Yeah, I mean, because the further south you go in the Rhône Valley, the faster it pumps because of that funnel action. And what's really interesting is what a lot of people don't realize is the wind blows so strong that it blows any clouds away as well, or sucks any clouds away. So when it's blowing, the air is crystal clear. So therefore, it's a very drying wind. So during harvest, when the Mistral blows, or during the growing season, if the grapes are past veraison, they increase in sugar by dehydration, not by ripening. So all the way down in Châteauneuf, you could see easily a percentage of alcohol just from a 3-day Mistral, potential alcohol just in the 3-day Mistral. And when it pumps, it's like a freight train. So I used to ride a bicycle from a neighboring town to where the winery was, and going downhill, you had to use all your energy if you were going against the Mistral. So
Crazy.
On one way to work, it would take me 5 minutes, and in the other direction, it would take me like 45 minutes.
Yeah.
It's also, I mean, that's why also most vineyards are bush vines, very low. I suppose you can't trellis with those type of winds, I would assume. So that's
and then to get back, Nick, to the soils. Then, so I think that the geology is quite interesting. Often we boast about in South Africa and the Swartland that we've got some of the the oldest soils in the world, viticultural soils in the world, which is true. The soils that we're working with here in the Swartland are 400 million years old plus, so really very, very ancient soils. And often in Europe, the soils there are much younger. If you go right to the south of France, other parts of Europe are much, much, much younger. We're talking from 2 million up to about 40 million years old. But parts of the Rhône Valley are really interesting because they're also actually really old. So you have some parts of the Rhône, the schist soils particularly, and the granite soils of Côte-Rôtie, Cornas, and Hermitage that are also hundreds of millions of years old. So for France and for Europe, they're some of the oldest and more interesting soil types. And it's also why there's quite a lot of similarities between the Northern Rhône and what we have here in the Swartland with the schist and the granite soils, which we'll chat about today.
I think when I was reading, and the way the Rhône Valley actually was built is by this clashing of, I mean, I can't even imagine the scale. Obviously, the Massif Central and the Alps clashed together, formed this gulf. The Mediterranean flooded it, so bringing in all the various sediment. And then, and I'm not a geologist, but then at some stage, it deflooded. And the kind of the river grew and created this very, very high slopes. So it's a really epical clash that built this.
So and that's exactly it. So the granite outcrops, which is Cornas and Hermitage, got pushed up when those two bodies of land kind of clashed, and the magma got pushed up, and that's where these granite mountains were formed in amongst the slate or the schist. And it's interesting because that's similar to what we have here in South Africa, where the slates and the granite were formed when South America and Africa were colliding. So it's a similar sort of thing, but just on a different time scale.
So I think just to one last point on the actual wider region is, so there is Northern Rhône and Southern Rhône. So this is quite a generic kind of division. But one point I'd like to make is that the Northern Rhône, and we will go into various pockets and appellations, is responsible for only 5% of the production of the Rhône Valley. So that's just put things into perspective. I think that is quite very important. And that the only red grape variety permitted in the northern Rhône is Syrah, while in the southern Rhône there is obviously a huge number of varieties that are being used. So this image says it all already. I mean, starting from right on top in the north, south from Lyon, probably together with Hermitage is the most prestigious of the appellations in the northern Rhône, is Côte Rôtie, which translated means the roasted côte is like a, how do you call it? Gosh, no, I have a blackout. Slope. Roasted
slopes.
Correct. And I think perhaps if you want, you work there, so if you can transport us there visually, because I personally haven't been, so I've studied on books, but and perhaps.
Well, yeah, I think the thing it's quite hard to convey just how steep it is. I think here in South Africa, it's actually illegal to plant on a slope that's more than 30 degrees. So 30 degrees is about that. When we get to 30 degrees in South Africa, you're actually not allowed to plant vineyards on steeper slopes than that. It's mostly just for safety and for erosion. So if you have a steep slope, the tractor can roll over, but also if you have lots of rain, the soil erodes and it's bad for agriculture. But in Côte Rôtie, they like, when you get to 30%, then they start thinking it's proper terroir. Lower than that, it's like, it's not really worth bothering with. And it's quite hard to get an idea of it unless you're actually in the vineyard, because in the pictures you're showing here, you have to stand when you're harvesting or pruning or suckering. You literally stand, and your feet is at one vine, but you're almost at chest height with the vine you're working with, and it's literally right in front of you. So you're dealing with slopes up to 60+%. So it's extremely steep slopes, and most of the best sites are the southern facing slopes. So if you drive down the Rhône Valley, you'll see it's not planted everywhere. The slopes kind of do this and undulates, and then the top sites are generally the ones that are facing due south. So there are some that face southwest, some that face southeast, but traditionally it's the warmer slopes, which are the south facing slopes, which are the best. Yeah,
and now obviously with climate change, as much as possible, no?
Yeah, but now with climate change, that is starting to change a little bit. So some people are preferring the southeast facing slopes, so they get generally just the more morning sun, and then the afternoons are cooler. So it'll be interesting to see over time how maybe some of the more famous sort of lieux-dits, which is a single vineyard, they might start changing, and others might become more famous over time. But yeah, they're extremely steep, and it's a lot of hard work. It's not child's play working there. Yeah,
and also what's obviously because of the the actual layout of the vineyards and the wind and other things. This is the way of trellising here is called échalas, if I'm correct, right?
Yeah.
So they have single vines on a pole. So it's basically like a bush vine just on a pole trained. Is that more or less a correct assumption?
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a couple of reasons for that. Yeah, échalas is two poles that kind of stand at an angle like this, and then they tie them together just for support. The South African version is just called stokbijpaaltjie, so it's normally one vine that stands up straight. And they do it for a few reasons. So firstly, Syrah is different grape varieties grow in different ways. So a grape like Grenache or Mourvèdre or Cabernet are very erect growers. So the shoots just go straight up. They kind of support themselves, and you don't really need to worry about them falling over, even if they get very long. But with Syrah and a few other grapes, they're very floppy. So basically the shoot grows, and once it gets to about a meter, it bends over. Right. And once a shoot starts bending over, it's getting a bit geeky again, but it loses, it's called apical dominance, and then the shoot it grows. It can grow like 5-6 meters long. So it's ideal to keep the Syrah shoot upright if the vines are vigorous. So that's why they will tie it on a stake, on a échalas.
Maybe explain what that means for people who don't know what echelon means.
I don't know what it means. No, you can explain. I don't know. Andrea's can explain something.
You said something wrong. No.
Well, maybe I'm wrong, but echalot means shallot in French, like the onion. So it's shaped. Right, when you tie it at the top, that's why it's called echalot. It looks like a shallot.
Well, I learned something new.
Yeah.
And with most varieties, most regions in the world with vines that are vigorous and falling over, you just put it on a trellis, like a cordon, like you see most vineyards in the world. But because it's so steep in Côte Rôtie, you can't plant poles and wires and straight rows. You have to make these little terraces, and so they can't put trellises and wires and have straight rows. So they just use these echelons to support the vine, really. So
kind of
it's a practical thing. Yeah.
To the territory.
Yeah.
So obviously, I mean, the presentation has a lot of information about the history of the Côte Rôtie, and we will share this with everyone, as you said, and people can go into the depth. And vines have been planted there for the last 2,000 years. Romans have been there. So we're not going to go into that details, because I actually want to more talk about your personal experience there and about the wines, especially that we're presenting. So I think the first wine we have on presentation tonight is one of the I think I can say most prominent producers that have made this region famous, and it's Guigal, and it's very famous for three single vineyard wines that they make, which is the La La La. I think there are the three La's. But this wine, which encompasses the two, so if I'm correct, the Côte Rôtie is separate in the Côte Brune and Côte Blonde. And I think maybe, can you just explain that difference? Because it's obviously, I think it's based on soil, if I'm correct.
Yeah. So in Côte Rôtie, it's mostly based on slate or schist soils. There's little pockets of limestone here and there, and then there are these outcrops of granite as well. The heavier, darker, pure schist, very rocky soils are called Côte Brune, which is like brown. So the soil there is very dark and brown. Again, quite similar to what we have here in the Swartland. We have two types of slate: brown slate on Casteelberg, and then on Porceleinberg, where Cully's farming, it's a blue slate, which you get more in parts of Germany, in the Mosel. It's a very hard slate. But in Côte Rôtie, it's more of a brown slate. It's a little bit softer, but still very steep and very well drained. And then the Côte Blonde is slightly lighter soils, a little bit more clay, and still based on slate, but often you get granite in there as well. So it's the two soils those are the two dominant soils in Côte Rôtie. But you do get differences as well. At the bottom slopes, there's some much deeper, more sort of alluvial soils. And then you can plant almost right at the top of the mountain range, where there's almost no soil whatsoever. It's just pure rock. And those are very dense wines. But the two most sort of important soils are the Côte Brunes and the Côte Blondes in Côte Rôtie. Yeah.
Right. And this wine, I think, is a blend of both. So it's a representation of probably an iconic presentation of the Côte Rôtie itself. And it is, we have 34 bottles of this wine, very representative of Côte Rôtie from Guigal. So if anyone is interested, obviously, just feel free to DM me. Where did you work in Côte Rôtie?
So I worked at a small family winery called Clusel Rock. They're in the very northern part of Côte Rôtie, so just closer to the Vienne side, so right in the north. So it was a small organic winery that had 4.5 hectares of Côte Rôtie and then 1 hectare of Condrieu. We're a brilliant family to work for. They were farmers. They were from the area, but made some really very, very, very special, very beautiful wines. But also very, very historical family. So they were related to the Jamets. I suppose most of the families there are related. But so thanks to them, I got to spend a lot of time visiting quite a few wineries there, and managed to spend a bit of time at Guigal with Philippe, the son, who's managing the place now. And blown away. Guigal they've got the best vineyards in Côte Rôtie. They are a large producer, but I think their wines are world class. You know, so often people, you know, kind of criticize larger producers, but you can't do that with Guigel. Their wines are absolutely world class.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So one last, before we move on to the next appellation, we travel down south. Interesting is that in the Côte Rôtie, you are allowed to blend Viognier in your Syrah. And where does, I've always wondered, where does that actually come from? So what was the original?
So it actually, well, there's lots of different theories, but speaking to the locals, the reason is there's traditionally been in the vineyard planted Viognier. So it's a kind of interplanted. There'll often be 2 or 3 or 4% Viognier interplanted in the vineyard. And generally, most producers historically would just pick everything together and you know, ferment it together. Obviously, Condrieu is just so Condrieu is right next door to Côte Rôtie. Literally, the one appellation ends and the next one starts. So often, historically, from the nurseries, you would get Syrah vines, but by mistake, sometimes there would be 1 or 2 or you know, 2% Viognier mixed in there by mistake. So people would plant the Viognier with the Syrah, not knowing that it's there, and then they would just pick it and harvest it. So it's kind of become tradition that they included. So it's some of the producers choose to harvest it separately or take those vines out, but others just leave it. So it's kind of a personal choice.
So it's a mistake. It's not an intentional, like, to add perfume type of.
Well, it's kind of become tradition now that it's there, and there is also some kind of winemaking benefits behind Viognier. So Andrea, if you want to.
So one of the ideas behind it as well, and it would work quite well in wet years, is Viognier is very unique for white grapes in that it has a red wine-like tannin in the skin. So the anthocyanins in Viognier actually help to bind the color, it helps to set the color, I should say, in the Syrah. So it's called copigmentation. So they're actually, scientifically, is a positive reason why they work well together. So if it's a wet year and there's not great color in the Syrah, the Viognier will actually help to set the color for the finished wine.
Yeah, amazing. So the next step is Saint Joseph, I think, if I go well by memory. But I just wanted to stay on the map because I just wanted to show the extension of it. So it's quite a long appellation that stretches from north to south, and probably that does make quite a difference as well in the way it's climatically and in the way it's geologically it's exposed. But what is your? I mean, explain to me a little bit, perhaps, the difference and how is the appellation seen?
For sure. So Saint Joseph is, as you said, the largest region in the northern Rhône. So it's a very, very long region. If you're driving on the highway, it takes probably half an hour if you're on the A1 heading south to drive down Saint Joseph. But if you're actually in Saint Joseph, it takes probably an hour and a half, 2 hours to get through it. It's a really long region, and because of that, it's very diverse. So the wines in the far north border on Condrieu, and the wines right in the south border on Cornas, and so there's quite a diversity of styles that come out of Saint Joseph. So it's really a region where you need to know the producer, and you need to know the style that you like. So if you like slightly more rustic, powerful wines, then a producer in the south, closer to Cornas, would probably be more interesting for you. And if you prefer a more Côte Rôtie style, slightly more perfumed and fragrant style, then a producer in the north might be more interesting for you. So it's quite an important region to know the producers and where they're located, and not just to say, this is a Saint Joseph, because there almost is no such thing as a Saint Joseph.
Aren't we lucky that we have an insider? So you've actually chosen wine for today, representative of the appellation, and I suppose you can explain now exactly the differences and where this one is located, and this producer, which is a very well-known family.
So I mean, it was great when you sent me your portfolio, because you've got benchmark producers for each region, so it wasn't very difficult to choose. But Yves Couilleron is a great guy. He's based right in the north, so he's actually really famous for his Condrieu that he makes. He's one of the reference producers for Condrieu, and you can imagine from what I've just been saying, someone based in the north of Saint-Joseph is going to be making a style slightly with a bit more perfume, more floral, you know, more on the sort of elegant style in terms of the aromatics. But he is also, he's not scared of a little bit of new oak on the red. So it's a wine that has nice texture to it. It's not a rough sort of grippy style that you would find in the south of Saint-Joseph. It's got a beautiful fragrance, but it's got a nice density to it as well. So his wines are beautiful, and I think they're really well priced. You know, that for what you're getting, you put those in a blind tasting with some of the more famous Côte-Rôties, and often his wines will show them up.
Yeah, and this particular wine is part of a collection that is imported by Alex Dale, which is one of our most successful vendors with the largest selection. And
Cool.
We have been able to secure a special price on this wine, which is, you know, we are not used to discounting. It's not something we do, and it's absolutely not our way of dealing with wines. But in this extraordinary moment, it is just a small incentive for our customers who have to wait for the wines because we are not allowed to ship, unfortunately. So this is why this specific wine comes at a better price. And the other thing is that all these imports will, with the next shipments, we'll see a very different price category because the rand has just changed and has skyrocketed and lost value. So I was speaking with Alex, and the scary bit is that he says that the next shipment will be probably 35% more expensive. So if you can get these wines now, I mean, we have 45 bottles of this Le Syrah Saint-Joseph. Do it now.
And it's actually just a quick little note on Syrah. So the name Le Syrah. So Syrah is the old, I don't know if it's Latin, but it's kind of a local dialect for Syrah. There's this kind of old mythical clone of Syrah called Syrah. And if you visit the producers there, they all talk about this is my Syrah, and that's because it's kind of their old vines that have been done through sort of missile selection. So it's not kind of an official clone you can buy from a nursery. But Syrah is kind of an indication of a kind of someone's own old vine cuttings that their dad and their grandfather made, and they've got growing in their own vineyard. And then producers like Yves, and there's a few in Côte-Rôties who will bottle their wines just from Syrah. So if you see Syrah, it kind of means it's Syrah, but it's not an official clone you can buy from a nursery. It's something that's unique to that producer from their family heritage. Yeah.
Did you put some in the bag of that clone?
Never.
Okay. On that note, let's move on to Cornas. I suppose the bolder style of the Northern Rhône. And tell me a bit more about this, because this is, as far as I understand, is not wines for early drinking. It's quite intense.
So I think this is the one. Yeah, Cornas and Hermitage are related in a way because they're both granite outcrops. So if you think of in South Africa, the Paardeberg Mountain and Paarl Mountain, they're both granite outcrops quite close to each other. And Cornas and Hermitage are very similar. So they're two granite outcrops that got pushed up when two continental plates collided, and then they cooled down and formed these huge granite outcrops. So there's a lot of similarities. The main difference is in South Africa, our granite outcrops are, I think it's about 200 million years older. So they've had 200 million years longer to erode and decompose. So our granite mountains are much more sandy soils and very deep soils, whereas in Cornas and Hermitage, they're very shallow and very rocky soils. So that's the one big difference is the schist soils in South Africa, in the Swartland, and in the Northern Rhône are very similar, but the granite soils are quite different. So in the Paardeberg, when we taste the granite Syrah, we talk about freshness and perfume, but in Cornas, because they're shallow, rocky soils, you get a lot of tannin, you get a lot of structure and wildness in the wine. So So that's quite unique to Cornas particularly, and it's also quite a warm site. It's a full south facing, and it's quite a warm, powerful site. So these are wines that are quite wild, quite tannic, quite structured, and need quite a bit of time. I think probably out of all the Northern Rhône regions, it's the one that, if you can, buy it and leave it at least 10 years before you approach them.
So would you say these are really the most rustic in styles as well? So bolder and more rustic?
Yeah.
And I mean, this producer is also, I think, novelty in Cornas, August Klapp, with, I think I have one bottle in the cellar, which is this amazing wine. Do you have any personal experience with this?
Yeah. So Olivier Klapp actually came to the second Swartland Revolution and did a seminar here. So he's been out to visit us all, and we've spent time up with him as well. So it's a very historical family winery. He is, I think, 4th or 5th generation, taken over from his dad, who took over from his grandfather, who took over from his father. And they only make Cornas. I think they make 2 or 3 bottlings, and the Renaissance is their sort of middle tier wine, which is an absolute reference point for Cornas. It's basically the reference point. They haven't changed anything. You go visit them. I think Roland often tells the story Roland Peens, when he visited there, he had to leave the cellar. He got an asthma tank from all the fungal spores down there. That's black. The barrels all look like they're 300 years old, probably because they are 300 years old. So they haven't changed anything in centuries, really. It's very, very classic, very traditional. But having said that, the wines are beautiful. They are powerful. They have a rustic tannin, but they're very intense, very complex, wild but beautiful wines.
One of the says about that.
Sorry.
I would say what Chris says about that stylistic continuity is so important, because oftentimes when you have historical cellars that are changing hands over generations, oftentimes the grandchildren look towards their grandparents. So almost every other generation, the pendulum swings, whereas with Klapp, with each generation, they're actually refining and refining and refining. So the style is very traditional, but the wines that Olivier is in charge of now are as traditional, but almost more refined than his father or his grandfather. So the wines of Klapp now are so exciting. They always have been, but they become even better.
So one thing we haven't touched on at the beginning, I suppose, on Syrah, but obviously one of the characteristics of making this one of the most noble grape varietals is the wines that they produce age a long time. I mean, from the wines that we've just spoken now, I mean, how long do you think a wine like the Cornas, in this case, would you be able to age it, and when would it develop and be at its peak?
Well, yeah, I think, pretty much all the wines we're tasting now or talking through now will age 10 years plus very easily. Most of them, like this, the Klapp, the Gigal, they've got track records to age 20, 30 years, no problem. I think that's one of the things with Syrah is it is generally a beautiful wine when it's young, and it has that versatility to age. Cornas is maybe the one exception where it's quite rough when it's young. So this is probably the one producer that benefits the most from aging. Although this is, their absolute top cuvée is particularly a wine that you need to age. This cuvée, you can drink it a bit younger, but at least I would try and drink this with 10 years of age if you can.
But Syrah is very much like Pinot Noir in that drink it young, like young, or wait 10 years and then drink it.
Yeah.
But if you open up a wine and it's too rustic or too young for your taste, just decant it. Syrah loves air. Syrah is naturally a relatively reductive variety. So I always say the most unnatural place for it to be is trapped inside a bottle. So if you open it up and it feels too tight or too rustic, decant it. Decant it for an hour, decant it for a day, decant it for 5 days or a week, until it tastes right.
Love that. You you mentioned Hermitage before, and obviously it's a world-renowned name, appellation, to the point that I was reading that there was a point in time, I think in the 19th century, where a lot of Bordeaux producers were bottling wines and called them Hermitage just because it was such a sought-after appellation that they were trying to fake that type of wine. So that was quite an interesting anecdote. So Hermitage is this, I go back to the map, it's this smallish appellation south here, and it's basically just a hill. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah. So Hermitage is a hill. It's also a granite outcrop, so like Cornas, and it's on the other side of the river. So we're now on the eastern side of the Rhône River, and the vineyard planted on Hermitage. It's a beautiful town to visit. I mean, the town is sort of right on the river, and then the mountain or the hill goes straight up from there. So it's an awesome place to visit and spend a few nights. The vineyards there are only planted there again on mostly the southerly slopes again, some southeastern and some southwestern slopes. So on the other side of the hill is just nothing. I mean, there's very few, or no vines really there.
And say again, they're in the shade of the wind, right? If I see that correctly.
Yeah, and also the southerly slopes, but traditionally the warmer slopes is where they planted. Yeah. So, yeah, and
so
it's like you've got here. It's one of obviously the real classic reference regions for the Northern Rhône. I think along with Côte-Rôtie, they sort of compete for the title of the best produced or region in the Northern Rhône. And there's a lot of very historical and very, very famous producers on the mountain.
Yeah, and perhaps that's quite so where the name comes from. So as far as I understood, it's just a little bit of a myth, but the names come from a hermit from this Henry Gaspard, which returned from battle and settled on top of this hill and as like a hermit, and basically that's how I suppose the hill got named since then. And there is this very famous vineyard which is on top of the hill next to this chapel, which I found a picture of, which is a very pretty picture, and that is called the chapel, La Chapelle, which is probably the most famous vineyard in Hermitage, if I'm correct.
Yeah. I'd say the most famous single vineyard on Hermitage is La Chapelle. Chapoutier has a few Larmites and a few others, but La Chapelle is certainly one with one of the best reputations, and particularly this cuvée, the 1961, is I think one of the greatest wines literally ever produced in the world. If you research it, the people who've tasted it, like Neil Martin, Robert Parker, they literally put this down as the top 3 wines they've drunk in their life. So this is a very famous vineyard and well-known producer.
Yeah, in this case, I mean, it was for this talk we sourced something special, obviously apart from your own wines, but as we're leading towards your own wines, and also an older vintage because of what you just mentioned before. So this takes time. So if someone is interested to enjoy something now, which has been stored perfectly, I mean, this is a 1999 La Chapelle, which probably it's in a perfect drinking condition at the moment. La Chapelles from the 90s are starting to drink lovely. I mean, we've had from the 70s, early 80s, and they're absolutely amazing. It is a producer that in the early 2000s, they kind of became quite modern. So the winemaking became a little bit more technical and interventionist for about 5-6 years. But the last five years or so, again, they've kind of got back to their old roots. So drinking from the 90s and the sort of after 2010, they're again very, very beautiful wines. So again, it's a larger producer like Digel is, but they're fantastic, a really good classic producer. How many producers?
Even in the more modern,
How many
I was gonna
producers
say, even in the more
farm that
modern
vineyard?
years, there's how many producers farm the vineyard?
No, that's a monopole. So La Chapelle is theirs. They are. That's it.
Exactly.
I was gonna say, even in their more modern years, the wines were, yes, a little bit more plush, but still like absolutely beautiful wines.
Amazing. So I suppose, okay, yes, there's quite an excursus here into La Chapelle, but our last, let's say, step into the Northern Rhône is the wines from Crozes Hermitage. And this is this interesting one because I think there's been some technicalities, and I think the Crozes Hermitage appellation was born a bit later. And maybe explain, this is a bigger appellation, probably the one that offers the best value, but has outstanding quality. And Graillot, you mentioned, you're sharing a distributor, and it's an extraordinary producer. So perhaps I'll let you present this wine.
Yeah. So you're right. Crozes Hermitage is again one of the larger regions. They're more on the sort of lower slopes of Hermitage mountain. So in sort of going southwards from the mountain. Or sorry, I keep calling it a mountain. It's a hill. And because of that, hill. And they're also kind of on the edge of the alluvial plain of the Rhône River. So they do have slightly deeper soils. So the wines don't necessarily have the same or quite as much density as you would get on the top of Hermitage or Cornas. But they're, as you said, they're absolutely beautiful wines. And Alain Graillot is really the producer who put the region on the map. So literally one guy is responsible for putting the whole appellation on the map. And he's known for a few things. One of the things is he's always been 100% whole cluster. We haven't really talked about Syrah and whole cluster fermentation. It's quite I think a relevant and interesting topic, but Alain Graillot has been from day one 100% whole cluster. So he doesn't even own a destemmer. It's literally everything is whole bunch. And that gives quite a particular style to his wines. It gives a lovely perfume and spice on the nose, and does give some backbone and tannin to the wines. And he does make a few different cuvées again, but his standard Crozes Hermitage that you have here it's an absolute reference for the region. And
outstanding value, I think, in general.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's difficult to. Yeah, it's almost impossible to beat. Yeah.
So, are you happy if we move on from Northern Rhône? I mean, obviously, it's for you as Syrah producer. Syrah shaped your career, your life, and everything. It's one of those regions that. I mean, do you go back often? What is your? I mean, I suppose you're tied here, but especially now.
Yeah, I think. I mean, earlier on in our careers, we would try and go at least once a year. Lately, we went once last year. This year we won't be going. But yeah, it's kind of a home. So for sure, yeah, we do try and get there as often as possible.
It's Syrah Mecca.
Yeah.
So now I have a surprise, obviously, because I thought, in honor of Andrea, I wanted to open, and someone probably already saw it, a little bit of a bracket and talk about a very exciting region that obviously shaped your life, Andrea, and it's very, very close to home, I suppose. It's your second home, your first home, I'm not sure. So we've just, also thanks to Alex Dale again, we're just able to secure a very exciting collection of new wave, I call it new wave, the word is a bit overused, but let's say new style Californian wines. And we've selected together one of them from Sonoma Coast, from a producer that you also are very familiar with and personally. And I think it's something quite extraordinary to be able to put this in this journey, in this collection, obviously because it's part of your personal history, but also for our viewers and listeners, it would be really interesting to benchmark the expression of Syrah from a classic Northern Rhône style to your very own South African, and something like this, which is perhaps less obvious for most, but I think California is coming into a new shape and into a new life. And maybe, tell me a little bit about California and what's happening there.
Sure. I mean, yeah. So California is, I like how you titled it the post-Parker revolution, because that's exactly what it is. You know, Robert Parker was so important for bringing attention and excitement around wine collecting. You know, internationally, people who didn't used to drink wine started to listen when they were, you know, reading about scores and excitement. Now, the flavor of those wines didn't necessarily agree with everyone, but I definitely give him credit for bringing in excitement around people with wine collecting and trying new things. And in California, you know, with California Cabernet, those were definitely in that category. But, you know, the passion of wine, the traditional wine styles never left. They just weren't the spotlight for about a decade. And then it really paved the way for, as people wanted to, now that they were into wine, trying other things, and young winemakers really wanting to express what they thought was exciting, paved the way for this new California revolution, you know, New Wave California. And, you know, now there's probably about 36 young winemakers, or relatively young winemakers, that have, you know, reinvented predominantly the older styles of wine, but either from sites that were underrepresented before, or from varieties that weren't widely planted before. I mean, a lot of people don't even realize that Chardonnay only became big in California in the 90s. Before that, Chenin Blanc was the #1 white variety in California. Zinfandel, Carignan, and Mourvèdre were the main red varieties before Cabernet. So, you know, modern California is really only a few decades old. And so Syrah is a relatively new, more widely planted variety in California. And the expressions of it can go from more Shirazan style, like you get down in Paso Robles, more warm areas, but in the Santa Cruz Mountains and then up into Sonoma, where it's physically much cooler. I mean, what we call cool climate in South Africa is not nearly anywhere as cool as the Sonoma coast or the Santa Cruz Mountains. You get those really long growing season. You know, you get those like minty and floral characteristics coming out of the Syrah, not as meaty and as jammy as you can get further south. So yeah, very exciting Syrah coming out of the areas. And one of the guys paving the way, or one of the wineries, is Arno Roberts, which you have, which is so exciting.
Yes, and so are we. And I think so. Also, one misconception is obviously climate-wise. So Sonoma has two parts, I think, or it's quite vast appellation, but Sonoma coast is perhaps the cooler side of it. Obviously, it's much closer to the ocean, and also benefits in this picture we've seen. It's just quite phenomenal. The whole region benefits from this fog, which has this cooling effect, which is incredible. So Arno Roberts, I mean, to be very honest, I have a beautiful bottle of Cabernet in the cellar, which my wife bought when we were there. But apart from that, I don't know the wines very much. So perhaps you can tell me a little bit about them. It's I suppose two friends that Duncan Arno Myers and Nathan Lee Roberts that started this brand. And then again, perhaps about their Syrah. I think they have a few different ones, but we have one on offer at the moment. What is your experience with these wines, and how do they compare with the wines that we've just kind of talked about?
So what's interesting in California is how young the soils actually are, especially on the coastline. So in, you know, we talk about how old the soils are in South Africa, kind of medium age then in the Rhône. And then in California, because of all the volcanic and tectonic action, you know, it's right on the edge of two plates. A lot of the soils are pushed up off the ocean floor. You're getting, you know, the salt and limestone along the coast, and more fresh granite in the mountains. And the eastern edge of California is lined by the Sierra Nevada mountains, and then there's a huge central valley, and then you get the coastal range. So what happens is, as the central valley heats up, which is full of very rich, very fertile soil. So, very vigorous growing in the center of the state. It sucks in the fog just because of the pressure differentials. So the reason why I'm bringing all this up is it really does lead to the winemaking or the wine flavors you get off the coast of Sonoma, where you have these more fertile soils, more chalky soils, so higher pH soils, which means lower pH wines, fresher flavors, and very cool, windy, foggy influences off the coast. And you taste that in the wine. So Arno Roberts, as a winery, has a more old world approach to all of their winemaking that they do from wherever the vineyards are in terms of natural fermentations, natural malolactic. They do work with a lot of whole cluster inclusion in their red wines, bringing out that freshness of flavor. But with those more fertile California soils, you still get that purity of fruit that you get in California that's very different from other places in the world. So imagine, old world techniques, but more pure of flavor.
Yeah, and I think they're a producer that's, it's not everybody knows about them, but they're really in California extremely well known and well regarded. They've been in San Francisco, the Chronicle has like a winery of the year every year, which is quite a prestigious thing, and they've been the winery of the year for California, and they just make absolutely beautiful wine. So I think what Andrea summed it up very well. They kind of, if they were in South Africa, we'd like to think they would be in the Swartland, because they follow a very natural approach in terms of trying to express terroir. But they're both trained winemakers. The wines have a lovely purity to them as well. So if you think you have a preconception about, and if you think you have a preconception about Californian wines are big and ripe and sweet, these guys will totally change that perception for you.
Yeah, and that is really the point. I mean, I'm a huge fan, and the portfolio we brought in is all in that style, and I really am a big sponsor of it. And if and I suggest that everyone tries this wine. There are only 24 bottles available. If you don't buy them, I will. So please buy them. I'm broke by now.
I'm just out of interest. I know it's off topic. Have you brought in any of their other wines, or just out of interest, or is it?
No, I think it's just a Syrah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Great. It's a beautiful wine. And
yes. So, and it's also, I think, it's not something you'll find in South Africa. In general, Californian wines of this style, you don't. And so I think it's a nice opportunity if you love the varietal to have it in the cellar and benchmark it. And you'll be pleasantly surprised as much as I was when I visited last. So then, Andrea, from your first home, we'll move on to your second and current home. That also doesn't look so bad. And I suppose I will talk a bit less now because I leave the floor to you guys. But I mean, what really the purpose of today is to show the progression of your personal journey and your experience through the various regions in the world and what shaped you, and also what the different representation of this varietal in different regions and how people work with it, and the friends you've made and the anecdotes you've experienced. But ultimately, I suppose the realization of your dream came through. So what started on a train to Champagne came through on Roundstone, I suppose. And I mean, tell me a little bit about this magical place, the Swartland, and then ultimately how you settled for Syrah and Chenin Blanc, and how that then transformed into the various bottlings that you will taste now and guide us through. But I'll let you guide and I'll follow your lead.
You want me to?
Yeah,
okay, cool. Yeah. So I mean, I think we kind of chatted about it earlier when we were talking about how we met. When I was working in Tulbach at Tulbach Mountain Vineyards, which is now Fable. We started a second label that was sourcing fruit in from other vineyards and other regions. So we were working with grapes from basically all over, from Elgin, Stellenbosch, Swartland, obviously Tulbach as well, a whole lot of regions. Different grape varieties as well. But over the sort of 4 or 5 years that we were doing that project, and the first, so 2003, 4, 5, and 6, I was on my own, and then Andrea joined the team in 2007, and that's when the quality went up. But you joined in 2006, yeah. We just fell in love with Syrah, and especially Syrah from the Swartland, because out of all the wines we were making in the cellar, the Syrah from the Swartland was the one sort of variety and the one region where we didn't have to do anything fancy in the winery to just make beautiful wine. The fruit came in, it was awesome, and we just let it ferment naturally. We pressed it to barrel, and it was just beautiful. So we were really interested in Syrah and Rhône varieties, but we just really realized that there was something super special happening in the Swartland, and got to know the region and the farmers very, very well. And Roundstone was one of the vineyards that we were sourcing fruit from then. So we were very fortunate to already know Ibn Sadi very well. And he introduced us to the vineyard. He was actually on the picture you've got up there, the vineyard on the left, so the straight rows that look a little bit like corduroy. Yeah. So that's called our schist block. That's the block that goes into our schist Syrah. And Ibn had started sourcing fruit from that vineyard. And the owner at that time said to him, well, I don't want to hassle with just selling you a few rows. You have to buy the whole block. And it was too much for Ibn. So he called us up and said, hey, there's this amazing vineyard I found. Do you want to share the vineyard with me? So we started working with it in 2005. And yeah, it became one of our absolute most important vineyards that went into the TMB wines. And then in 2007, when we started our own project, the owners of TMB decided to discontinue their Negociant range of wines. So it was a great opportunity for us that we could just carry on with those agreements and work with those vineyards for Mullineux. So Roundstone has always been one of the core components of our Mullineux Syrah.
I think
so Roundstone is, yeah.
No, sorry, I'll let you finish.
No problem. So Roundstone is on Kastilberg Mountain. So just a bit of a geography, kind of quick updates on the Swartland. Swartland's a very big region. It's I think if you look at a map of South Africa, it's the largest wine region in terms of area, but it's not not a region where there's vineyards planted everywhere. So most of the vineyards are planted on or around the mountains that are found in the Swartland. So that picture that you can see there is on Kastilberg, which is the mountain just outside Riebeek-Kasteel. And this picture is looking south, so away from the mountain towards Table Mountain, which you can see right at the back there. But in the foreground is the Paardeberg. So the Paardeberg is one of the other important mountains in the Swartland. And those for us are the two most important terroirs of the Swartland, and they're very, very, very different. So the Paardeberg is very similar to Cornas and Hermitage. It's a big granite outcrop that got pushed up about 400 million years ago when South America and Africa collided. And it's been eroding ever since. And then Kastilberg is in the north, so it's about 20, 25 kilometers away, which is slate or schist soil that you will find very similar
in this picture.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So those are the two main terroirs that we work with. We also have vineyards planted in between the two mountains, so on those sort of brown rolling hills that normally where wheat is found in the Swartland. And those are where you find the iron-rich soil. So they're very rich in clay and iron, and they make quite dense, meaty, rich styles of Syrah. So those are the three main terroirs we work with Syrah in the Swartland. And our Mullineux Syrah is always a blend of those three terroirs together. As I was saying earlier, when you think about France and Europe, often more Mediterranean regions that are closer to the ocean are blends of either different grape varieties or vineyards. And we make what we think is a very, very complex, very balanced wine by blending Syrah from these different soil types together in the Mullineux Syrah.
And so like a Swartland blend. So it's like, is it like your presentation? So just one thing about this picture, which There you go.
So that's the straight Mullineux Syrah. Yeah, the flagship we call it.
Flagship.
Yeah.
On these pictures, it's just such an incredible picture. So just wanted to mention here, that's Table Mountain, right?
Yes, correct.
Mm-hmm.
And this spot is where you offered me an Aperol Spritz.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
I didn't take this picture though, but it's a very beautiful. So when did you move in? I mean, this is your home here. So literally, right now you are in here, I think. Exactly where my area is.
We're actually just off to the left. We're in one of the farm cottages, but yeah, we're just about there right now. Yeah, so we're very, very close to that.
So just if you briefly explain me just a little bit of a timeline. So you mentioned that you started farming this vineyard here and you started buying grapes from here. So when did you move in here and when did this become home?
Yeah, so we purchased it officially in 2014 when it went on, well, it actually never went on the market, just chatting with the owner, with the vineyards we were farming, and he both him and his wife were foreign, and it was at a time when they either had to renew their visas or move on, and they decided actually to move out of the country. And so it was just very fortuitous that it was at a time when we were ready to mature as winemakers and purchase our first piece of land. So yeah, that's when we took over. But on the site, the only vineyard that we were working with at the time was the one that you see on the left-hand side, the corduroy rectangular block. So that is our schist block of Syrah. There were a few other blocks on the farm, Grenache Blanc, which goes into our Mullineux White. There was some Merlot that we decided to heavily prune the first year, and we're actually planting that over to experimental varieties this year. So we actually are finished plowing to plant the cover crops today because we're hopefully getting a little bit of rain this weekend. And then another block of Syrah that is south-facing. So obviously in the southern hemisphere, south-facing are the cooler slopes. So in the Swartland, it's very preferred. And then the beautiful curved block in front of you, planted on the contours, is what we call the palm block, due to some palm trees that are planted towards the bottom of the block. And it's quite interesting. In the Swartland, you often see at least one or two palm trees planted on the properties. And it seems bizarre to have in a hot, dry area a palm tree planted. But the reason why they were is on Casteelberg specifically, there's a lot of springs that come out of the mountain. So our entire property is only fed by spring water. We don't have any municipal water. And so springs and water would have been very valuable for the foretrekkers or for people passing through 100 years ago. And a palm tree, because they can grow so tall, was almost like a flag to say, hey, I've got water here. So it was a way to maybe show off that you had water, but also to offer water to passersby.
Like an oasis.
An oasis, exactly. So in fact, in the lower part of the block, all the way to the right of the picture, is where the palm tree is, and that's where there's a large cluster of fynbos, because that soil was actually too wet to plant vines on. But water is scarce in the Swartland, and we want to conserve it. So the reason why this vineyard is planted on curves, on the contours, is for two reasons. And one of them is for conserving water, so that it runs the water when it does rain very slowly through the vineyard by running along the contour instead of straight rows where it would just wash away. This helps the water to penetrate the soil as much as possible. But then also when there's excess water, the contours run off in a patterned way so that it runs directly into our dam as well. So it's like harvesting the water. And the other thing that it does is it conserves the soil. So as Chris said, we have very, very ancient soils that are very, so we have very ancient soils that are very fragile, and we have very, very little topsoil. So in order to conserve it, by controlling the way the water runs through the vineyard, we conserve as much soil as possible.
And it looks pretty.
And it looks pretty.
Yeah, and you'll notice also in those sort of the vineyard is interplanted with fynbos.
Yeah.
So there's rows of vines and then there's rows of fynbos. Yeah, and that's quite. It's for us. It's a pretty large block. It's about 20 hectares. So that's a pretty large block of vines to plant. So we didn't want to create a monoculture of just vines everywhere, because then you start to break the natural balance that you have in the area, and then disease becomes a problem, insects become a problem, and you need to start spraying heavy chemicals. So this was Rosa Kruger's brainchild. She obviously, we worked very closely with her in the vineyards, and her idea was to break up the vineyard using fynbos. So we got a local nursery from Riebeek West to go in the mountain and take cuttings of the indigenous fynbos that grew there, and plant that in the vineyard when we planted the vines. So it's a home for natural insects, for wasps, for ladybirds to live, and then they go and feed on the aphids and things that are in the vine. So they keep that natural balance that was already in the Swartland. Yeah.
So traditionally in Europe, you'll see this kind of pattern of growing in organic vineyards, just so you have that healthy balance. But obviously we didn't want to, we wanted to use only our local vegetation to bring our local insects back into the vineyards.
Cool. Yeah, and maybe if you want to move to the next slide, I think, or the following one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just a great picture of the Swartland. It's obviously traditionally a wheat farming area. So there's vines are not the main source of income here. Wheat and oats and cereals are really what makes the region tick over. And then this again is a picture of our schist block. So this is the Syrah that Eben introduced us to, and we still sell the rows that he always got grapes from to him. So as a kind of a thank you for introducing us to the vineyard, and because he's a good friend, we wouldn't kick him out. So he still gets the top 10 rows of this block. But that's, I think, just a great example of how we farm the vineyard. So Andrea chatted about cover crops. Again, like we were talking now about trying to keep a natural balance. We don't want to spray any really hard chemicals, any pesticides, and also any herbicides. So in between the rows, we plant cover crops every season, which help to build organic matter in the soil, keep the moisture in the soil, keep the soil cool, and keep weeds away. And then underneath, hi Tammy, underneath the vines, you'll see we pack straw. So we're very fortunate that we've got neighbors who farm wheat and have got thousands of bales of straw. So we source thousands of bales from them every year, and we pack those under the vine. So again, underneath the vine, we don't have to spray any chemicals to kill weeds, and it keeps the soil moist and cool. So again, just part of the approach to trying to farm as naturally and sensibly as we can.
Amazing. So if you're ready, would you like to start going through the wines?
Yeah. Hopefully everybody's got a bottle with them, so I'm sure everyone's thirsty by now.
Yeah, I hope for them, but I don't think many are lucky like we are after, I don't know how many days now, 4,500 days of lockdown, or how many have just passed. But we've got the 2017 Syrah up first, which is the current vintage.
There we go. It's always easier to talk about a wine when it's already in your glass. So, I mean, the reason why I love Syrah is because it really is that chameleon of terroir, where it really expresses where it's grown. And so even though this wine is grown on the 3 different soil types, which we'll get into the specific soil types and what we're looking for later, for me, this is just that ultimate expression of Syrah grown in the Swartland, where you get the aromatics, you get a lot of spice, as opposed to primary fruit. It's more about, I always refer to them as holiday spices, cloves, cardamom, cinnamon, as well as the dark fruits. We're in South Africa, we've got this abundant sunshine, so fruit's not hard to come by, but we're not looking for primary fruit in this. And working a lot with whole clusters, crushed whole cluster. So even though Syrah is already highlighting the area in which it's grown, so those Swartland tannins, for me, the whole cluster is put a magnifying glass on whatever it is you're looking for in that site. So bringing out the fragrance, the lilies and the violets, bringing out the spice, but also pulling the tannin together. In a warm area, the tannin naturally is a little bit more soft, a little bit more supple, but it doesn't happen that way everywhere. In some places, you know, a warm area means it ripens too fast, but it's probably then the wrong variety grown in the wrong place. And when a grape ripens too fast, you have unripe tannins, which just really aren't attractive. In the Swartland, the reason why we know Syrah is one of the correct varieties to grow here is we get that physiological ripeness, we get that beautiful color without trying, we get those ripe tannins. So it's easy then to handle gently in the winery. We don't want to over extract because it naturally gives everything that we're looking for. The color is natural, the texture is natural. If we start to push too hard, both physically and emotionally, onto the grapes, like with children, it's going to start to fight back. So we let it give what it wants to give and then stay as hands-off as possible.
And this Syrah is always, as I said just now, always a blend of different soils and different vineyards together. So the flagship Syrah is generally between sort of 7 and 9 different parcels from different parts of the Swartland. So it's giving you a representation of sort of the whole Swartland region through the lens of Syrah for the vintage. And obviously, depending on the vintage, we will blend it slightly differently to make what we think is a really balanced and complete wine. So the granite soils in the Paardeberg, which are really deep, very sandy soils, tend to always bring a slightly higher acidity and a bit more perfume. So in a warmer year and a drier year, those sites become really important. So from 2016 until 2019, those sites have been really important to keep acidity in the wine, freshness and perfume that we then don't have to, again, interfere in the winery by acidifying or doing anything, really interventionist. So this Syrah for us is always our sort of, representation of the whole of the Swartland, like the Gigel, the Brunet Blonde would be. This is our sort of version of that just gives you a great representation of the whole Swartland.
That would have been also my question. Sorry.
Yeah. I was going to say, it's interesting with the vintages. We started with the 2014, that's the beginning of the seminar, and we're drinking the 17 now. And a lot of people think, in the New World that we don't see much vintage variation. But for me, even though we're not really dealing with too much, harvest rain where you have a washout vintage or with hail in the spring, we have different versions of harnessing the sun. So as Chris said, in 2016 with the drought, it was really hot and dry. So created this incredible concentration without being heavy. 2017 was a bounce back year. So just a little bit more, not even elegant, but just balanced on the palate, not as extreme in the tannins. 2018, all of a sudden there's this more structure coming in again. So we definitely have vintage variation, even though we're a warm New World climate.
So while you were presenting, we had a lot of viewers, listeners that just wrote in the chat. And it's fascinating is like everyone was sharing what vintage they're drinking, and from all over the world. We have different, we kind of have a virtual vertical happening. And, some are opening the 14, some are opening the 15, some in the US. It's too early for wine. Even if I don't agree, it's never too early for wine. But
no, lockdown is airport time.
Exactly.
No one's allowed to drive anywhere.
So David, who is in the US, open your bottle of wine that is sitting there. And then we have a lot of viewers from the UK as well, which also I'd like to say that we will stock. We've launched in mid-April our UK store, port-to-port/UK, and we will stock Mullineux wines within the next couple of days. So I'm very excited about that because we tried to make it happen in time for this talk, but it will happen in the next couple of days. So would you like to move on to the next wine, Chris and Andrea? You happy?
Yeah, I think the next wine is good because it's related to what we just tasted. So this is the 14 vintage of the same wine, and just a bit of back note. So we do keep back some library stock every year. It's not always easy to keep back stock, but we try to be very strict with ourselves. So yeah, we keep back a couple of hundred bottles every year, every vintage, and we've built up quite a nice library now. And I think one of the things we've realized at the moment is a lot of people have been drinking up their cellars during this time because they can't buy wine, so they're digging into wines that they were aging. So we've decided to release a couple of the older vintages onto the market for people who've maybe drunk up their 14s or other vintages. So we made, I think, 60 bottles available to you guys, Nick. And generally, this wine will be priced quite a bit higher. We generally add a margin every vintage, but just for this seminar, we thought we would just offer anybody a thank you for joining us today, and thanks to you guys. So we're offering it at the same price that the 17 sells for, which is a nice gift to you guys for joining us today. 14 would have been the same vineyards, Andrea, as the 17, but obviously a different vintage. This was before the drought, so the weather conditions were quite different here. So how's it different for you in terms of the style?
Yeah, so it was actually an insane vintage. Let me just answer that one. It was an insane vintage in terms of it was cool. You know, we had a damp spring, so there was some disease pressure, and it was relatively cool of a growing season. And then all of a sudden, in the weather forecast, it was forecasting in like early March an insane heat wave, followed by thunderstorms. And so we had, from this long, cool, slow, early picking season, every vineyard had to be picked within like 3 days. And Chris and I were just tag teaming each other. We didn't have any employees yet in 2014 in the winery. So we were just taking turns being awake. We had still have small children, but they were even smaller then, taking turns with the kids, not sleeping, just getting everything in, getting it fermented. But we got everything in at the beginning of the heat wave, before the thunderstorms, because a lot of people suffered in South Africa for later ripening varieties. When you have heat and thunderstorms, it's not a good combination for vineyards. So, but because of that long, slow growing season, followed by a heat wave, which is when we picked, it's much more plush, it's much more supple. It's awesome to drink right now. There's that background freshness that you get from Swartland wines, even though it's not an acidic wine, it's a fresh wine, but very rounded off. So it's definitely probably one of the sexier vintages of Syrah that we've had.
Yeah,
and I'm trying to keep up, and I think we already. I mean, I know that we already sold out as you were talking, so I'm really trying to keep up with the chat. It's difficult
You'll
to
have to speak
follow.
to Nicolò.
So
yeah,
yes, so I think
I'll answer. Henk has a question just about the vintages and peak times. We did a vertical last year, so 2017 is our 10th vintage. So we did a vertical tasting on the farm here, so our first 10 vintages. And I think what was great, really fun for us to see and very rewarding for us to see was from 2008, which was our first vintage, till 2017, we haven't vastly changed much at all. We obviously improved the health of the vineyards and the farming. We've added 1 or 2 new parcels, but from the very first vintage until 2017, it's been the same vineyards, very much the same winemaking. We've always had a very similar approach in terms of a portion of a whole cluster, the same sort of oaking regime, the same aging regime. So it was really interesting for us to taste 10 vintages alongside each other with a nice group of people, and see how the wines are evolving over time. And there is a bit of vintage variation, so depending on how dry or how warm it was, or the rain spells. But the 3 vintages you've asked of, 09 is probably the vintage that is the densest. So if you like sort of more richer, riper styles of Syrah, that's the 09 is probably the the richest that we've bottled so far, and it's drinking absolutely beautifully now. The 2010, that was our first Platters 5-star wine, I think, or Syrah.
2009.
Oh, okay. Well, the 2010 was the Syrah of the year, the red wine of the year. Yeah. So that's still quite tight and closed. It's got a lovely perfume and spice to it, but that's definitely a vintage that can age a bit. And 2011 is kind of in between the two. So it's got a bit of density like the 09, but it's got nice structure and length. So I'd say of the three, drink the 09 first, maybe now over the next year or two. Keep the 10 for a few more years and the 11 in between the two. Yeah. Sorry, Andrea's popping up to get a spittoon.
Oh no!
Getting a charger. No, charger. Sorry, a charger.
I'm just so sorry. I'm probably oversold, so I'll have to chat to Nicolò.
Speak to Nicolò. Yeah.
Somehow. So yes, let's move on because otherwise I get in trouble. Let's move on the next wine. So these are your single vineyard ones. So this I was very excited to hear about.
Cool. So we do in certain vintages bottle some of the vineyards on their own, and I think what I've said a few times so far is in an area like the Swartland that's a bit more Mediterranean in climate, blending vineyards and blending grape varieties is a way to ensure that every vintage you can bottle a wine that's beautiful, that's complex, that's balanced, that's complete. So that's why every vintage we can make a Mullineux Syrah that has that complexity and that balance that we really want in our wine. But having said that, we do have some sites in the Swartland that are really, really, really interesting, some single sites. And in certain vintages on their own, they're absolutely fantastic. So it doesn't happen every vintage, but in those vintages where we think they're absolutely beautiful and truly world-class, they have a sense of place, and on their own, they're beautiful, then we do bottle them on their own, and we call them our single terroir range, because obviously we try and make the wine in a transparent way where the terroir is shining through. And the thing in the Swartland that has the strongest sort of effect on terroir is the soil. So if you look at regions around the world, we've spoken about the Northern Rhône, we've spoken about California. In different wine regions around the world, terroir is kind of composed of different things. So California, the fog has a huge influence on the terroir. So the effect of the cooling effect of the fog is stronger than the soil. You can plant Syrah in different soil types, but the fog actually overrides that in many ways. Whereas in the Rhône Valley, the climate's quite similar, and the thing that changes quite a lot is the soil type. And in the Swartland, that's what we find. The weather in the Paardenberg and the weather on Kasteelberg are pretty similar. And the soil is really what makes a huge difference in the terroir, in the composition of the terroir. So because of that, we name the wines after the soil type. So the first is the granite, and then we have which is from the Paardenberg, and then the second that we're going to taste is the schist, and then the third soil type that I mentioned is the iron Syrah. So those are the three main soil types we work with in the Swartland.
And you don't make them in all years, obviously. So it depends on how do you determine that?
We make them every year, but we don't bottle them every year.
Right.
So for us, what's important is obviously, we make the Mullineux Syrah every year, and the schist and the granite and the iron and the quartz soils, those vineyards are in addition to our main wines, the Mullineux White and the Mullineux Syrah. So we never take away from our main wine if we're making these other wines. These are always in addition to. So even though we're making them every year, they have to have that geeky definition of that variety on that soil type for the vintage. And it must be balanced. It must never speak too much of one aspect more than the other. If you can't tell that it's Syrah in the bottle, what's the point? But it also, similarly, it has to taste like 2017 and that soil as well. So in 2016, for example, when it was so hot and dry, we didn't do a schist Chenin, for example, because it spoke so much more of the vintage than of the variety. Yeah, so that being said, the other main aspect of terroir is actually obviously the people in the vineyards, and we keep that as similar as possible, not just in the vineyards, but in the winery as well. So the winemaking technique for these two wines, our schist and our granite Syrah, are identical. And that really also lets that soil shine through. So these are both 100% whole cluster. Maybe just show them both at the same time. They're both 100% whole cluster. I only do these in maximum 500 liter batches for the fermentation. So that way it's only hand punch downs for a few reasons. One of them is just to have that more intimate experience with the fermentation, so you can feel if there's warmer patches or cooler patches. Helps keep the fermentation more even when we want things to be as similar as possible to let the soil shine through. But the other reason is it's literally as gentle as you can be. So fermenting wine whole cluster is like brewing tea, where if you take that tea bag and you can get more extraction by squeezing it, and you get more color and you get more extract out of it, but it's going to be bitter, it's going to be out of balance.
Yeah.
But if you just do a gentle extraction, just dipping that tea bag, or in this case just gently only with the hands punching down the grapes, it's going to be a gentle natural extraction, and it's only going to release what it wants to release. So it might not be as dense or as extracted, but it's going to be fragrant, it's going to be balanced on the palate, and that's the most important thing for us.
Amazing analogy, actually. I never thought about it that way. But it does a lot. I mean, tea also brings me back to the tannin factor. Obviously, that which is something that in tea is quite common. But this is quite interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, so it needs to have tannin, it needs to have color, but we only want it to give what it wants to give.
So this total expression of soil, which is the main component of terroir in this case, as you mentioned, Chris. So yeah. Suppose tonight I think we're showcasing the schist, the schist and the granite.
Yeah.
So specifically these two, like next to each other, same vintage, same winemaking. How does it reflect? So my two questions are: how does it reflect in the wine, and how would these two wines compare or put into reference to all the wines we went through today, and also from the different regions we went through?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of the crux of everything. So to answer the second part first, I think it's really important that South African wines find their own identity. Obviously, we try and make our wine in I suppose you could call it a more old world approach, where we want to have a sense of place and a sense of balance and elegance in the wine. But that doesn't mean we're trying to copy the Northern Rhône. It doesn't mean we want our wines to taste like Côte Rôtie or Hermitage or any. We always want our wines to have our own DNA, our own definition, and their own character. I always tell people if you're wearing a fake Rolex and someone says to you, "Oh, that looks like a Rolex," it's not really a compliment. It's saying, well, it looks like the real thing, but it's not actually the real thing. And so often people will come and say, "Oh, your wine reminds me of this Northern Rhône wine region," and in a way it's a compliment, but at the same time, sometimes it frustrates us because we're trying to make our wines taste like the Swartland, and it must taste like Swartland Syrah. So I think Andrew's already explained that. I think one of the things we have that's a bit more in South Africa is we have a bit more sunshine than the Northern Rhône. It's often a little bit drier. You mentioned that in the Northern Rhône they have a lot of rain during the growing season, which we don't have. For us in the Swartland, in summer it's dry. Those are the two main things. We have more sunshine. It's not necessarily warmer, but it's definitely drier. And those two factors mean we have a bit more density, more mid-palate on all of our wines naturally. So we don't have to, as Andrew said, extract a lot. It naturally comes out that our wines have this lovely richness to them. And then on the nose, we have a bit more dark fruit. There is some spice and sort of spicy, peppery aromatics, but it's not that like white pepper. It's more of kind of a bell pepper or a black pepper spice that we get in our Syrahs. So that's how we kind of are slightly different to the Rhône Valley. And then between these two wines, the granite is in the Paardeberg Mountain. Those are the very deep, sandy, decomposed granite soils. And because of that, the vines have this huge root system. The roots of the vines are 3, 4, 5, 6 meters deep, and that protects them against the warm, dry conditions that we have here. So the roots of the vines always have access to moisture, and that protects them. It kind of allows them not to get too sort of stressed and struggle in the dry conditions. So they always have a very good acidity and a lot of floral perfume to them. The schist, on the other hand, is on Kastilberg. These soils are very similar to Côte Rôtie, so very, very rocky, very shallow soils on a slope. And because of that, you get more density, more tannin, more structure, and a little bit more sort of dark fruit rather than floral and spicy aromatics. So those are sort of the two main differences between the schist and the granite. And obviously they are distant cousins of the Northern Rhône, but we like to think of them as unique. They're Swartland wines, so they need to have a Swartland character and flavor.
I just think it's obviously what they have in common is the varietal, and then the interesting journey that a wine lover can do and embark on is to compare without, obviously with every example has its own very strong identity, but I compare how they express differently in California, in the Northern Rhône, and in South Africa. And I
think what's great is you having such a great selection of Northern Rhône wines is, buy one that picks your fancy and buy one of our Syrahs and taste them next to each other. Get your partner to pour them blind for you and think about them. That's what I love. We always say these are wine geek wines, so we make these for people who are obsessed about wine and want to understand it. And that's why we bottle these wines. It's for those people.
But also
it's not about comparing.
Exactly.
For us, it's not about comparing to see who's better in a like, oh, mine's better or yours is better. But it's about using those comparisons as learning experiences to be like, oh, wow, like what I'm finding in this granite is actually very similar to what I find in this Hermitage structurally. So for us, it's, you get into the geekiness of having two wines side by side rather than a competition.
Exactly. So for me, comparison is just a matter of, what are the differences and how does it compare? I think it's not necessarily better or worse, but it's just different. And this is what is exciting. And the other thing which is exciting for me, and especially right now, and I think where it comes out it shows the most value, is wines in the end of the day stand for a sense of place and represent a sense of place. Right now, it's very clear that we are not allowed to travel. We are not allowed to move. So what the wine in a bottle allows us to do, whether it's from a specific place or whether it's been purchased on a special trip, it allows us to travel. And it allows us to relive certain experiences or to try and be transported through the bottle by it.
Definitely.
It's really something that maybe before was a given. It was, you take a bottle from the shelf and you were opening it and you're drinking it and you were enjoying it. Right now, I think what everyone should do is just stop a second and understand, where does this bottle come from? What is the story that it has to tell? And just spend a minute to appreciate that, because it went all the way, and it allows us in the same way, by appreciating it, to go on the same journey, similar to the journey we went on today. Every single bottle has this magical opportunity that it offers us to go and embark on that journey. So this is really important. So, I'm opening the floor for questions, and I think while we talk, I'll ask you a few more generic things before I let you guys enjoy your evening. And I think our braai is, hopefully my tummy has put some wood on, because this magnum needs to be finished with some lamb. So, by now I think we kind of figure out that Chenin is the flagship white varietal for South Africa. A few will argue, but I'm just talking about right now in the market. Would you say that Syrah has the chance to be that red flagship varietal and stand for South African wine? Because I mean, we're seeing, apart from the Swartland, it's obviously the Swartland red varietal, which is at least for me. In Stellenbosch, there are incredible examples, and there's more and more coming up. So would that stand next to Chenin? And you obviously figured it out quite early as the South African red wine varietal.
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question. I don't think anyone can answer that with any certainty, to be honest. I think Syrah definitely does well here for sure, and I think we're learning it, learning where it works well. You mentioned Stellenbosch, like Polka Dry does extremely well. Blauklippen Valley, that part of Stellenbosch, I think do extremely good things with Syrah.
Samantha O'Keefe with Drayton is a great example. So yeah, like the different characters you get from Syrah throughout the South African wine growing areas is immense. Yeah. So that being said, it's very versatile here. But we don't want to diss any other variety.
Yeah, I think our experience, well, with working with Liupasant and the Cabernets we've been exposed to in Stellenbosch have blown us away as well. So Cab, it has its place as well. Cab Franc, I think, is extremely exciting. Grenache, I mean, some of the Grenaches that are being made now from the Paardeberg and here on Kasteelberg is also very exciting. So I think Chenin has kind of got an advantage because it's been here since 1652 when the Dutch planted it. So we've got our own unique clones of Chenin. It's got this 300-year advantage over any other red grape. So I think Syrah definitely works well in many places in South Africa, and it's got a very important and exciting role here. But I think it's quite hard to say that it will be the grape, and I don't, to be honest, I don't think it will be, because other grapes do really well here as well. So
there's many the grapes.
I have on that note, I have a question, I think, from Dan, and I mean, it's a little bit off topic, but he mentions that good Cabernet Franc is mainly undersold and undervalued, I would suppose. Is that is it fashion, or is it what does that depend on?
Yeah, I think I'm very excited by Cabernet Franc, especially in certain places. So Helderberg again, Polka Dry is, I think, for Cabernet Franc extremely exciting. I think though, again, we need to learn how to work with Cabernet Franc. We need to, often people treat Cab Franc almost like it's Cabernet, and they over oak it a bit and over extract it. Cabernet Franc is more about perfume and freshness. So the producers like Lucas van Rockenberg and guys who are a little bit more hands-off and sensitive to it, I think do really beautiful expressions. So I think Cab Franc's got a very exciting future, but it's quite specific. So I wouldn't go planting it all over the show. You need to really plant it in the right place. But then it's world class in South Africa if it's in the right place.
So the other question I had for you is, so apart from the regions that we touched, if there was one place you would plant Syrah, where would it be, apart from your own home, obviously?
In South Africa or in the world?
Anywhere. I was
going to say Walla Walla, Washington, where it already does so well. If anyone gets a chance to taste Walla Walla wines, the Syrahs from there are just also world-class, super expressive. When you taste a wine from there, it can be from nowhere else, but it's just this explosion of Syrah. And that's what, I think you were saying earlier, is when a bottle of wine can transport you to another place in the world, that's when you know it's a special bottle of wine. It doesn't matter the variety or where it's from. When it takes you to another place without a passport, it's pretty cool.
That is
and I'm going to be more controversial. I mean, Walla Walla is if anyone ever gets to taste a bottle of wine, so Washington State, north of California, I think I'd like to say something more controversial. I think if I had the chance and I had the land, I would love to plant a hectare of Syrah somewhere in Burgundy. And it may sound totally insane, but with climate change now, you hear the Burgundian producers complaining that they have 14.5%, 15% Pinot Noirs. Someone should take out a little bit of Pinot and plant some Syrah and see how it does there. I think it could be very interesting.
Now, who knows? You might get back on that train to Champagne. I mean, that's quite close.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, guys, I mean, I'm gonna just start closing here. We had an amazing 2 hours together, and I think most of our listeners and viewers have been with us until the end. It has been extremely informative, entertaining, and my absolute pleasure to spend some time with you guys. It's
thank you.
You know, it's sad that we don't get to see each other, and I think right now, especially in the last couple of months, it's been so clear that it's so nice to just be able to, you know, take a drive to the Swartland and come and visit. But right now it's not possible. But you made it possible for us to spend 2 hours in the Swartland with you, travel around the world, and get up close and intimate with what you've experienced from the train to in Champagne up until Rhône. And so I'd really like to thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. And you guys are an example for the South African wine industry, young, dynamic, extremely successful, and flagship bearers. So in a moment where we all struggle and where there's so much difficulty, I think you guys stand for what the hope in this industry is. So thank you very, very much.
Oh, thank you.
We will make this book available.
Thank you, and thanks for all your hard work. I mean, you guys are tireless and have been working at what you do for a long time. So we really appreciate it, and thanks to everyone for joining us. Yeah, it's been a quick 2 hours. So
and thanks for this, especially it got quicker with this. So
cool.
The talk will be. So tomorrow we will put it on YouTube, so everyone can just have a look and share, please. And we will also make the PDF available. And if there's any other questions to Chris and Andrea, you can just pop us an email, and we will then just answer them. I think everyone is. I mean, you guys can see the comments. Everyone is thanking you, and from all over the world. So it's quite exciting and emotional. Fantastic. So thank you so much. I will just end here, and you guys have a lovely evening. Yeah, I think they've been muted now. Unmute. Who muted you? There you go.
Do you guys know?
Yes, you just got muted for a second. I didn't mute you. Perfect. Can you hear us?
Bye-bye, everybody. Yeah, we can't hear you.
Cool. Bye. Thank you.